Okay, so today I'm going to give a bit of an overview as to exactly why the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church, has fallen into effective total corruption, why they've departed from the historic understanding of traditional marriage and all these other things like that, why there is a dispute in the leadership, and why it seems like the people at the highest levels of authority in the Church of England have seemingly unilaterally just departed from the entire church tradition of Christianity on a whole series of different topics, from women in leadership, marriage and the family, and a whole series of other kinds of things, promoting um, alternative relationship types and things like that. So I've created a small presentation which goes through some of the key elements that are in place and why it's important to understand initially the foundation of the actual church itself, because this will enable you to understand why things are the way they are and how we've actually arrived in the situation that we're currently in at the moment. So here we go. The gentleman on the right is Justin Welby, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, as well as the former head of the Church of England. The Church of England is obviously an international body of churches that have leadership in England because that's historically where it started. And Justin Welby was always known as the first among equals. So he had a lot of influence. He wasn't like the Pope, but he exerted a great deal of influence on all the other churches, especially from a funding perspective. So the man on the right is King Henry VIII. He is the founder of the Church of England. And what I'm going to cover in this presentation is some of the reasons why King Henry VIII actually founded the Church of England. What were the motivations of the King of England? Why did he begin the Church of England? And what did he do to the old Christian tradition that existed beforehand? And there isn't enough time to go into all the details of exactly what happened, but I would like to give a bit of an overview of some of the key motivations. So just to give you some perspective on what was happening, King Henry VIII at the time was married to this woman on the right. Her name is Catherine of Aragon. Okay. So by the late 1520s, so this is the 16th century, but it's 1520, King Henry VIII wanted to have his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, effectively invalidated, which would enable him to marry another woman. The couple's sons died in infancy, threatening the future of the House of Tudor, which was the kind of a famous royal family at the time. Although Henry did have a daughter, Mary of Tudor, Henry claimed that the lack of male heirs was because his marriage was blighted, or you could say cursed, in the eyes of God. So Henry VIII was really frustrated because he wasn't able to have a son. Whenever he had children, and he actually was able to produce a few sons with this woman, but they died in their infancy. And ultimately, at the time, it was a patrilineal succession. They wanted a male heir to secure you could say, the future of England at the time. So these are the kind of political situations that were happening. His wife was unable to have a son. He felt like he was cursed by God. He was frustrated. He was angry. Catherine had been his brother's widow, but the marriage had been childless. So the marriage was not against the Old Testament law, which forbids unions only if the brother had children. So this woman was previously married to Henry VIII's brother. He died. And because she didn't have a child with that man, it was okay. It was permissible in a biblical context for King Henry VIII to marry this woman. So moreover, the previous pope had given dispensation to allow for the wedding. Why? Because at the time England was a Catholic country, so the pope had a lot of influence on the nation. So he actually had a lot of influence over kind of things that happen in religious life and kind of marriage life and everything. So King Henry VIII argued that the dispensation to marry Catherine of Aragon is wrong, and therefore the marriage hadn't been valid. He's trying to argue, saying, hey, there's a technicality. The marriage isn't technically right because of XYZ. So in 1527, King Henry VIII asked Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So what he did is he sent a formal letter to the Pope, who was Pope Clement VII, this gentleman over here. Very, very fine looking individual in terms of his clothing. But yeah, so he sent a request that would have been via letter to Rome. However, when the Pope received the letter, he refused. He didn't allow King Henry VIII to divorce or annul specifically his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He said no. And what he said was, according to the Catholic teaching, a valid contracted marriage is indivisible until death, meaning there's nothing that anyone can do once two people get married and they actually sleep together, which they didn't even have a child. So the only way for that marriage to then end is for one of them to die, because it's until death do you part, as we say. So the Pope can't annul the marriage. Many people at the time close to Henry VIII wanted to ignore the decree by the Pope. However, in October 1530, a meeting of the clergy in England and lawyers advised that the Parliament of England did not have the power to empower the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time to act against the Pope's prohibition. So that is the effective backstory for what was happening at the time. Henry VIII wanted to get his marriage annulled. The Pope refused the request because he upheld the biblical teaching that marriage is a lifelong union. And as a result of that, Henry VIII, he was motivated and he said, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to find another way. So here's exactly what happened. When the Pope refused, which is the gentleman on the right, Pope Clement, Henry used the Parliament to assert royal authority over the entire English church, which was a Catholic church at the time. In 1533, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, barring, or you could say banning, legal cases from being appealed outside of England. And what that means is, if there was a legal dispute happening in England, one of the individuals in the case could say, hey, I appeal to the seat of Rome for their perspective and understanding of and their judgment in the case. So what this did is it stopped them from being able to appeal to anyone outside of England, which gave them more authority. Okay, so this act, this law that was passed, it allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's effectively the leader of the church, to annul the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon without reference to Rome, or without taking into consideration the authority of the Pope as the leader of the visible church. So in November 1534, the Act of Supremacy formally abolished papal authority and declared King Henry VIII, this gentleman right here, the supreme head of the new Church of England that they established. Okay? So the Act of Supremacy abolished papal authority and declared Henry VIII the supreme head of the church. So he established his own church because he didn't want to accept the biblical teaching that marriage is a lifelong union. The church was established on false pretense. And here's what he did next. Even though Henry VIII's religious beliefs remained aligned to traditional Catholicism through his reign, albeit there's a small set of changes in terms of, you could say that, they started to kind of develop their own understanding in some respects, but he still had a firm commitment to royal supremacy. In order to secure royal supremacy over the church, however, Henry VIII aligned himself with Protestants who at the time were treated as heretics. The main doctrine of the Protestant Reformation was justification by faith alone rather than good works. But the key thing to know is that between 1536 and 1540, to consolidate his power as the new visible head of the Church of England, a new church, King Henry VIII engaged in what is called the dissolution of monasteries. Okay? And I want to tell you and describe to you exactly what happened in the dissolution of monasteries. Here we are. Okay. So, just to give you some perspective, King Henry VIII, here we are. So, just to give you some perspective, King Henry VIII, he effectively disbanded and seized the property that was under the direct control of the Catholic Church. He disbanded the religious houses, he appropriated their income, he disposed of their assets, and provided pensions for former residents. The properties were sold to pay for wars at a later time in history. So just to give you some perspective on some of the statistics, the dissolution of monasteries in the late 1500s was one of the most revolutionary events in English history. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England that were directly under control of the Catholic Church, and around 260 monks and 300 for regular canons. 142 nunneries or places where nuns congregated, and 183 friaries, and some 12,000 people in total, 4,000 monks, 3,000 canons, 3,000 friars, and 2,000 nuns. One adult man in 50 was in religious orders. So one in 15, out of every 50 people, one was in a religious order or house. And I want to go a little bit further here. So Henry VIII disbanded Catholic monasteries, convents. He seized their wealth, he disposed of their assets, and he provided their former personnels and functions, and he handed over all of the wealth, all of the property, all of the buildings that were actually built by the Catholic Church over generations. You got to really understand this. It was one of the most significant transfers of wealth in history. He seized the properties, okay? He took the money, and then he enriched himself and his new church, okay? He enriched himself, and he effectively handed over all of this property that was seized from the Catholic Church at the time. This is all history now. He took all the property and he gave it to his new subjects who swore their allegiance to him as the King of England. So this is incredibly important to understand when you are learning about the foundations of the Church of England and the fact that they effectively stole all of the wealth and from the Catholic Church that was established, because their new church effectively was built in a single day, and they said, okay, we're going to take all the infrastructure of the previous time period, as well as all this tradition and history. We're going to take all their property, all their buildings, all their churches. We're going to seize all of it. We're going to drive the individuals who are in these churches underground. We're going to persecute them, and we're going to enrich ourselves and make our church, the Church of England, the strongest force in the nation. So this is the foundation of the church. The foundation of the Church of England was based on corruption and false pretense. And the fact that many people in the Protestant churches today look towards the Protestant Reformation with this kind of more romanticized image, and they don't really understand the actual history where individuals like Henry VIII, for example, literally stole property, land, resources from Genuine Christians, people who were good people. These people weren't involved in any of the politics. They're just the everyday person who are in their monastery, praying every day, doing their prayer role. Henry VIII said, "We don't care what you believe. Your property is now mine. Your wealth is mine. Your treasure is mine." They took the literal treasury, the donations that they've been collecting they took all of it and said, "It's ours now." I know this might be quite shocking for people to hear, but this happened. It's a genuine historical event, which is shocking. And often these are the things that aren't really known or really discussed anymore because again, it doesn't represent the kind of the public relations narrative that the Catholic Church was evil and the Protestant reformers were all, righteous and holy. No, these individuals had political motivations for what they did. And Henry VIII, as a prime example, established an independent church for the purpose of gaining greater power, but also establishing his own authority in the nation and consolidating his power amongst the entire country. And he was prepared to even steal from actual Catholics in the region to do so, as well as kill by killing people who were Catholics um, who didn't agree to his leadership. So this is a very, very important this is a very important moment in history. And every single individual in the country who was in religious life, they were commanded to take the oath of supremacy. And the oath of supremacy was effectively saying, I recognize that Henry VIII is the king and the leader of the church. Sir Thomas More, who was an individual who was, very influential in the Catholic Church, he rejected the oath of supremacy and he was killed and convicted of treason and executed because he refused to accept that this church, which was effectively built on false pretense, he refused to accept its legitimacy because he recognized it wasn't legitimate. The power grab, the stealing, the corruption, the dissolution of the monasteries, going around. He said, "I cannot, in good faith, accept this individual corrupt church," and he died as a result of that. And there were many other individuals who were killed at the same time period. But Sir Thomas More is obviously a very famous, recognized individual who deserves a lot of respect for his courage, for his unwillingness to accept the blatant corruption that was going on in the Church of England at the time. And just to give you some perspective, while after Henry VIII separated from the Catholic Church, establishing himself as the head of the English Church, Sir Thomas More rejected to acknowledge Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, as well as he also rejected the annulment of the marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That's also something interesting as well. He also said that the marriage was not annulled. He rejected that. So he was convicted of treason and he was executed. And his final words were this: I die, the king's good servant, and God first. Okay, that's very powerful. So I said before, if the Protestant Church of England was founded on both false pretense and corrupt ground, why do so many Protestant Christians always speak exclusively about the corruption of the Catholic papacy? Yes, there's corruption in the Catholic Church. Yes, this is self-evident. We understand this. This is a historical fact. But there's corruption in every church. And the foundation of the Catholic Church is actually founded on truth, not heresy. Okay. Why is this important? Why is the foundation of the Church of England important? Because it established the church as the national Church of England, and it created in the same moment a connection between the church and the state. This is incredibly important to understand. The moment Henry VIII became the visible head of the church, there became a symbiosis or connection between the church and the state. And so long as the state supported Christian values and had a strong faith, like, for example, Queen Elizabeth I, who is on this slide here, she was a very religious woman, despite her corruption. She was also a corrupt individual to a certain extent. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't completely corrupt. She did do good things as well, but just to give you a balanced perspective, she made bad decisions as well. She was a religious woman. So the connection between church and state were very, very, very powerful and influential. They were one entity. This idea of separation in church and state simply didn't exist at that time in the 16th century. But as time passed, and as the generations went on, and we could speak about a whole series of things that happened. There's so much that happened in the 16th century onwards. You know, the religious war, so many things happened. But here's the point. The connection between church and state was never a problem when the state was religious. But as secularism began to increase, the Enlightenment period in the 17th century, as we kind of move to the kind of late 19th century, things are becoming more secular. There's a time period where they create a clear-cut separation between church and state in England. And this is something that's done by Parliament. There's a separation of church and state in England. And then Parliament starts to have a very clear, you could say, their power increases and the Church of England's power decreases. There's a specific moment in time where the influence of the church started to become more diminished. As people became more secular, we entered the modern age, we entered the age of reason, science, all these things. The influence of the church becomes smaller and smaller. But one thing that has never changed, okay, despite the fact that we're living in a secular society, despite the fact that things have become, religion seems to be fading away in the modern world. We've just gone from the 15th century back to kind of modern times now. One thing that hasn't changed is that the Church of England is the state Church of England, and only the Church of England receives state funding. The Catholic Church as well as the Catholic Church in England does not receive state funding, and churches that aren't that are also not the Church of England, so just random Protestant denominations that people just invent, also don't receive church funding to the same level as the Church of England. Sometimes the Church of England actually does donate to other churches as a way of supporting people in ministries, but for the most part, the Church of England is the one who receives the bulk of the money. And this is the key point as to why the Church of England has become corrupt. There is a symbiotic relationship between the Church of England and the state in the United Kingdom. There is a symbiotic relationship, and I'll tell you why. Because ever since the formulation of the Church of England, they have become dependent on the state to fund their initiatives. So if there's a church, for example, that is damaged, the state, due to the public money that they receive, the Church of England receives money from the state. Okay, so over the course of 5 years, which is between 2016 and 2021, the Church of England received £750 million in public money. And the reason why the Church of England receives £750 million is because it is the national church. It's the state church. So the state is obviously producing billions of dollars every single year through taxation and other initiatives and investments and everything. And a proportion of the money that is collectively earned, it's a very small proportion, to be honest, if you look at the total budget and available funds that they have. But a small proportion of those funds go to the church. And when I say small, I'm saying in relation to the entire budget, which is ridiculous amounts of money, more than you could ever imagine. But the church received, over the course of 5 years, £750 million. Okay. And when the state was more religious and the moral fabric of the state was stronger and more consistent with Christian values, they were handing this money over to the Church of England without any real, you could say, request. They're saying, hey, it's the historic church. We have to support the church. We have to make sure the churches are maintained. We have to make sure the schools are funded. We have to ensure that education is correct. We have to ensure that our students are in Church of England schools are receiving proper education and formation. This money is spent on a whole series of different initiatives. And this is also the money that the Church of England uses to exert influence over the entire Anglican churches all over the world. Because they take a proportion of this money that they receive and they donate it to smaller parishes all around the world, and smaller Anglican churches, like in Korea and certain African countries, they depend on the donations to a certain extent from the Church of England. Because not every single country that has an Anglican church in it has government support. So the Church of England directly supports thousands of churches around the world through this money. But here's the problem. When the nation becomes more secular and the state becomes more secular, what happens? They start saying this: we're only going to give you this money if you, for example, allow women to be bishops and priests. It's the first request. We're only going to give you this money, or we're going to reduce the amount of money we give you. We're going to give you, let's say, for example, over 5 years, they gave them 750 million. They'll say, okay, we're only going to give you 300 million over the next 5 years. That's going to significantly impact their operational effectiveness in the world. If the budget is significantly reduced like that, they're going to be half as effective. So behind the scenes, these aren't conversations you're ever going to see in the media or news. Behind the scenes, individuals like Justin Welby, when he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, would be sat in a room with politicians and members of the Treasury, as well as individuals who decide how much money they donate every single year. And they would be exerting extreme pressure beyond anything you could begin, beyond anything that you can begin to imagine. They are exerting extreme pressure in the form of threats. If you do not obey the state, if you do not support alphabet, rainbow, alternative relationships, marriage between two men and two women, if you don't support these values, which are now the secular liberal values of the West, which we view as the ultimate divine revelation from ourselves, unless you support our values, you're not getting your money. You're not getting your money. You're going to get less money than you get. And because the Church of England and the state of England have a symbiotic relationship, and ultimately the Church of England depends on the state. They're not an independent church. The Catholic Church in England is an independent church that is not funded by the government. Okay? The Catholic schools are not funded by the government to the same degree. A lot of them are private schools. Okay, just to give you some perspective there. They depend on the donations of their parishioners, and that gives them a certain independence. Churches that depend on donations of their parishioners gives them a certain independence from state values. Whereas because the Church of England is the national church of the country, they cannot, the leadership effectively has to decide if the Church of England wants to be a smaller church, because it will effectively be a smaller church if they receive less funding. But the leadership has said, you know what? There's so much money coming in. There is so much money coming in from the state. We would rather continue to have 750 million every 5 years than 400 million or 200 million. You see what I mean? Because all it takes is the state to say, "Hey, you know what? We don't want to support them. They're not agreeing with our values. They're traditional. They're archaic. They're barbaric. They're holding their holy text, and they're trying to use that to take people's rights away. We don't think you should get the funding anymore. We're going to give this $750 million to an alphabet community that's supporting Western liberal values. We're going to give this money to a special interest group that's supporting the marriage between two men and two women, for example." The government has the power to do those things. They have the power to reallocate that budget. For example, they'll say, okay, instead of giving the Church of England $750 million, £750 million, we're going to give them 500,000, and then we're going to take the 250 million that we have extra, and we're going to give it to an organization that believes in marriage between two men and two women. That is what the Church of England, the state has the power to do. And because the church has bent the knee from the very beginning, remember, from the very foundation of the Church of England, they got on their knees and they bent to Henry VIII and said, you are the head of the church. Even though the individual was a corrupt individual, even though he went around the entire nation stealing property from people, doing things that were completely wrong, all of the priests and the bishop said, you know what? I would rather bend the knee to Henry VIII than bend the knee to the Pope. But the sad truth is, in this case, the Pope was the one who was upholding the biblical tradition. And I want to speak a little bit about the Vatican, because the Vatican does get a lot of negative media attention, conspiracy, a whole series of things. The Vatican is an independent country. It's a nation. And because it's an independent country, and because its values are principally established on Christianity and tradition of the church that goes back to the earliest centuries, it's a traditional culture. The Vatican is the direct enemy of the globalists today. You know why? Because the Vatican has a lot of money, they're wealthy, they're very rich, and they exert global influence all over the world. 2.3 billion people, Catholics right now. Okay, there are so many people in the world who recognize the authority. Excuse me, I made a mistake. There's 1.3 billion Catholics. 1.3 billion Catholics. There's 1.3 billion people on earth today who recognize the authority of the Pope and recognizes the accuracy of the teaching in the scriptures. Yes, there's going to be people who, they lapse, but the fact is they recognize that the Pope has authority and actually teaches the truth when it comes down to faith and morals. It doesn't mean the Pope as an individual person is a righteous person. No, there have been good popes, there have been bad popes, but the fact is they recognize, even if it doesn't matter what country they're in, they recognize the correctness and accuracy of the teaching in the tradition as it relates to faith and morals, specifically faith and morals, proper marriage, all these things. And because the Catholic Church is an independent country, it's a nation that has existed for over 2,000 years. It is not under the subjugation of anybody. It is not dependent on England to survive. You understand what I mean? No one can control or exert influence or force the Catholic Church to say anything. It doesn't mean that the individuals, popes haven't been corrupt. Of course they have been, but I'm trying to give you a perspective here. The Church of England is effectively under the dominion and subjugation of the state. And if the state uses its leverage, which is this 750 million that they give them every 5 years, they can get the Church of England to start approving things that go against the Bible. And this is exactly why I've left this particular screen on there because I want you to really absorb that. This is exactly why the church has fallen, because they've bent the knee to the state. The leadership at the highest levels have bent the knee to the state. Okay, look at all the property that the Church of England owns. 150,000 acres of land across the country. Churches all over the world. Church okay, the secular state of England, the hyper-liberal secular state, is now in direct control of the Church of England because the Church of England depends on them financially. This is the reason. A lot of people have tried to understand why is it people are misinterpreting the scriptures, because they're not sitting in these rooms where the Archbishop of Canterbury and his leadership are being threatened that they're going to lose their funding. They're not part of that conversation. They just see Justin Welby going on TV and saying things that doesn't make sense. They don't recognize that these individuals have been bending the knee to the state from the very beginning. And I'm telling you something, my friend. You can criticize the Catholic Church all you want. The Catholic Church has held on to the biblical truth as revealed by Jesus Christ from the very beginning. Okay, you really need to recognize the political corruption that has gone on behind the scenes in the Church of England, which is exactly why we're in the situation we're in right now, where the Church of England has effectively apostatized from the faith because they have chosen to accept the money rather than affirm the truth. And Jesus said very clearly, the love of money, the love of money is the root of all evil, my friend. It is incredibly hard for a rich man to enter into paradise. You remember what Jesus said? It's easier for a camel to go into the eye of a needle than for it is for a rich man to. If you choose money over truth, you're always going to perish, my friend. And the Church of England has chosen to receive the funds rather than stand for the truth. That's what's happened. They've accepted the money and they've discarded the truth so they can keep the lights on effectively. Okay? This is the fact. And I just want to highlight something quickly, what Jesus said to Peter. And I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That is a very serious statement. The gates of hell shall not prevail. So if you see the gates of hell prevailing against the church, that is not the church that Jesus Christ established. And if we go back to the very beginning, like we said before, the Church of England was established based on corruption and false pretense. That's a fact. That's a fact of history. And this isn't about trying to bash the Protestant church. I'm trying to give you a perspective of the foundation. Not every single Protestant church was founded in such a corrupt way like the Church of England. Okay. And that is also another reason why America specifically, because there is no state church, there is no state church that depends entirely on donations from the government. Churches sometimes do receive government grants here and there, but there's no official state church. The churches in America have a greater ability to withstand political corruption because they're more regionally controlled. They're controlled in a more regional sense. And that's another reason why Christianity is so strong in America, is because the people are the ones who fund their church. And they didn't get so comfortable sleeping in silk sheets and, living in these lavish palaces that were built and also stole from Catholics. They stole it, as we said before. They didn't get so comfortable living in these. They built a very humble and simple understanding of the religion. Okay, so no one can take away their religion from them. You have to corrupt every individual in America to corrupt the entire church. Whereas in England, all you need to do is fund and control the finance, and then you can corrupt the church and you can make the church do whatever it is you want. But because Catholics in this nation, and I'm speaking about Catholics specifically, recognize the authority of the See of Peter, as well as the church teaching and the magisterium and the historic tradition of the church, it doesn't matter what the state says, and it doesn't matter what a state church says. We affirm and recognize the original consistent teaching of scripture. And it doesn't matter if the entire English nation becomes corrupt. We're always going to stand on the historic faith. And the Vatican and the Catholic Church cannot change teaching on morality. They physically can't do it. If the Pope tomorrow comes out and says it's okay for two men to be in a relationship and we're gonna bless this and we're gonna try and actively say it's moral to do this, he ceases to be the Pope at that moment in time, and he will be replaced with someone else who's more humble and respectful of the tradition. Even Pope Francis giving his opinions and trying to toe the line, he has had to be extremely careful, because if he comes out and says something that goes directly against the church, he ceases to be the Pope. It's that simple. Okay. There have been many corrupt popes throughout history. Even Pope Alexander, this individual, okay. If you study this guy's life, he was a corrupt individual and he used money and power. He was a Medici. He was one of the Medici family. He was a corrupt individual in his own personal life. But when it came down to speaking the moral teaching, do you remember what Jesus Christ said about the Pharisees? Do not follow the works of the Pharisees, but do what they say, because they're teaching the truth, but they don't do it. Pope Clement, as the leader of the church, spoke the truth, but his personal life didn't reflect that truth. That's exactly what it is. He spoke the truth. Henry VIII's divorce and annulment was invalid. He spoke the truth, irrespective of whether he was a righteous person or not. As the Pope, as a bishop in the Catholic Church, you cannot teach false teaching, or you'll be removed. Period. You'll be removed. Okay. And I know there's a lot of anti-Catholicism, there's a lot of anger because you've been swimming in a Protestant swimming pool for your entire life. You don't recognize there is value in tradition. There is value in tradition. And I'm saying it clearly. On this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail. And if the gates of hell prevailed against the Anglican Church, or it's not the Church of Christ. And if the entire, and you got to, and what I have to say though, the corruption of the Church of England has been one of the greatest Trojan horses, bait and switches I've ever seen, because instead of the members of the community having to build up their own resources, they can now steal the resources that have been accumulated in the Church of England over generations, and then they could use those funds to direct towards their own hyper liberal initiatives. So instead of trying to spend the money to spread the gospel, they're going to start spending church funds to spread their own hyper liberal, evil, Luciferian, satanic values. But they would think about how long it would take them to earn $750 million as a small organization. Whereas now they've taken over the Church of England. Now they're directly in control over how they spend that money. It's one of the most sophisticated forms of the Trojan horse that I've ever seen. It really is. And that is the reason why the Church of England is corrupt. The Church of England is corrupt in very simple terms because the secular state is now in direct control of the Church of England. And the bishops and the leadership, as well as the archbishop and individuals at the top, have bent the knee to the state. Why? Because they need to keep the lights on, to preserve the millions of dollars and millions of pounds of public money that they receive. To maintain that money, they've sold out the entire church, my friend. That's the difference. So just remember, my friend, the leader of our church is Jesus Christ, but Jesus Christ works through people. And there is a visible church today that is maintaining the moral teachings of Christ. And no power on planet Earth has the authority or the ability to get our church, the Holy Catholic Church, to change its doctrines on a foundational moral teaching that has already been defined by the tradition. No government, no power, no authority on earth today have the power to take over the church. And let me tell you something. The Catholic Church is the number one enemy of the world. You know why? Because it's independently wealthy. It's an independent country. There's no master. There's no one who can exert authority over us. We have a seat in the United Nations because we're an independent country. And it is the only institution that is organized and unified in a way, 1.3 billion people. We have loads of resources, my friend. And we're standing on the moral teachings of Jesus Christ in a world of secularism. Okay? It is the only institution on earth today that has any power to threaten the globalists and Illuminati conspiracy that we can see all around us. It's the only institution. It's the visible church that has the power to actually challenge the wickedness of hyperliberalism, because they can buy any Protestant church in the world if given enough time. Because ultimately, Protestantism is based on biblical individual interpretation, so they can just pay people to interpret the scriptures differently. But you cannot buy your way into the church. It is what it is. Many this is not an easy period of time right now. We're going through a lot of challenges. There's a lot of corruption. There's corruption even in the Catholic Church today. But the fact that the dogmatic teaching of the morals of the church is unchangeable, it's unbreakable. You can't change it. It preserves the truth. So while the Anglican Church or the Church of England has fallen, the church established on the seat of Peter is going to stand until the end of time, my friend, until the very end of time. And look to Rome. Look to the church established of Peter if you want to know what the truth is. If you ever want to know the correct understanding of who Jesus is, human sexuality, human morality, if you want to know how to be a good Christian, look to Rome. Does it mean Rome is perfect? No, there's been innovations. There's been things that have happened. People have, in their exuberance, have elevated Mary to a station that she shouldn't even be in. There were people who were doing things that are actually wrong. We acknowledge this, and this is for another video. But what we must recognize is in a world full of darkness, the only way to understand the truth is to look towards the historic Church of Jesus Christ. And for those who say, no, 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 we can just look towards the Bible, here's the problem. If you have the Bible alone without the proper interpretation, you can end up being a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon, or you can end up just coming to a conclusion that Jesus isn't God or something. Without the historic teaching, you're lost. You're lost. Just the Bible alone is not enough for you to know the truth. And even Protestant churches are still rooted in the truth of Catholicism, because they're rooted in the historic Catholic definitions and the ecumenical councils. They recognize the authority of the early church, which is what the church is. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying pray to Mary, any of those things. You don't need to do those things. I'm not saying do that. But what I'm saying is this: you must recognize in a world full of darkness, there needs to be a visible church that actually represents Jesus from head to toe, that's founded upon his values and his principles. It's important. This idea that there's an invisible church. No, it's visible. You can see it. You can go to it and you can learn what you need to do to inherit eternal life. Okay? Because when everyone's constantly debating and fighting each other over doctrine and trying to argue, and Jesus has established the church to teach you the truth. Okay? It's just a little point here. The Anglican Church, the Church of England may have fallen because they've been bought and sold. They've been bought and sold at the highest price. The Church of Jesus Christ, they said clearly, okay? They said very clearly, the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. And it is the oldest institution in the world, my friend. The Roman Catholic, it's the oldest, and all of the negative media, all of the media that's controlled by all these, they all hate the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church represents truth in the face of a world that's preaching lies. The Catholic Church affirms unequivocally that God exists in a world where they're trying to teach you there is no God. It teaches the authority of God. It teaches you must be moral. It teaches dogmatically heaven and hell exists. These aren't opinions. They exist. You understand what I'm saying? This matters. So my advice to all those who are confused, look to Rome. You will find the truth. And yes, there's some problems. We acknowledge that. But I'm saying focus on the faith and morals. Don't focus on Marian dogmas. Don't focus on intercession of the saints. Don't focus on relics. None of these things matter. What matters is God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is what matters. Truth is what matters. Moral teaching, knowing the correct moral teaching. You need to put aside your frustrations and your rage and your anti-Catholic bias. You're going to recognize, my friend, your church is being destroyed before your eyes, Protestant, my friend. Your church, Anglican, your church is being destroyed before your very eyes. It's been bought and sold. And if you want to know the correct teaching, Rome will teach you. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, bless every single person who watches this video. Amen.